Hey, it's Renee from the craft table. We are at week 9 of our summer embroidery stitch along. As you can see, I am not in Montana at the moment. I am in Orlando. I came home for a quick trip to get some things done. I also use the opportunity for being home to schedule a live Zoom stitch in, for lack of a better description of what it was. I want to thank those who attended. It was a small group, but it was a great group. I enjoyed chatting and stitching. My original thought was to record the live Zoom for those who could not make it, but I ended up not recording it. But I had promised an extra embroidery stitch. So I did record that. So I included that quick tutorial at the end of this week's fly stitch tutorial. So I hope you'll enjoy that. One other thing I need to mention is with my traveling, I did not bring the original embroidery panel with me. So while I do demonstrate the fly stitch this week, I don't have my panel to show you where I stitched it originally, but I didn't really stitch it in too many places on the first time around. So I don't think you're missing too much with me not having the panel with me. So I was looking at the list of stitches still remaining in the stitch along, and I realized that I did not apply any of those stitches to my original panel. When I was looking at the calendar and planning the stitch along, I noticed that June 1st is a Saturday and August 31st is a Saturday. So I thought that would be a good time to start and stop the stitch along. And so I, of course, included all the stitches that I had applied to the original panel. And then I filled in the other weeks with stitches that I thought would be a good addition to apply to this particular fabric panel. So it'll be fun to add those and see how that changes the look of the panel that I did the first time around. So I didn't use the fly stitch in too many places originally. Your panel may be different than mine, and so you may find that you have more opportunities to apply the fly stitch on your panel, or you may not want to do it at all. And of course, as with all the stitches, that's fine. I just want to go over as many stitches as we can in this 14-week stitch along. And it's another one of those stitches that I have used in so many projects. So even though it's not used a lot in this particular project, I still think it's a good one to know how to embroider. I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to stitch the fly stitch on this sample piece of fabric that I have here. I marked 3 dots as registration points. We're going to do kind of like a V, and then there's going to be a tail. Depending on how wide the top of your V is, and then how long your V is, and then also how long your tail is, will determine what your fly stitch looks like. So I've brought my needle up at the beginning of my fly stitch, and it's going to be the upper left part of the V, and then I'm going to take my needle back down even with where I came up, making it parallel or even right there. And then I'm going to pull it to the back, but I'm not going to pull it all the way. And then I'm going to bring my needle up, and I'm making sure that that I'm going to be making a loop with my thread. And then I'm going to take my needle to the back and pull it all the way to the back. And I can either do it right here, and that would make it a scallop looking stitch, or I can make it a little bit longer like that. And you're going to bring your thread and needle to the back. So let's do that again. I don't have anything marked here. I'm going to bring my needle up where I want my stitch to start. And then let's make it a little bit wider. So again, I want to make sure it's even. But I'm going to take my needle to the back, and I'm leaving this loop right here. Then I'm making sure that it's going to be in the middle. Doesn't matter how far down, but I want to make sure it's centered in between this spot and this spot. And so I can make it, again, I can make it as short as this. So it's like a scallop. Or I can make it super long. You can stitch a border of fly stitches. You wouldn't want them 3 different lengths like this, but say for instance you wanted like a scallop border. You could stitch them side by side. I like to sort of nest them vertically, and that's what I did on the panel. And I'll demonstrate that in a minute on the actual panel. But the way that you would do that is you would make your first stitch however wide and long you want it to be. If you wanted to, what I call nest them, which is what I like to do, I would start my stitch even with where the tail begins. What I would do is I would bring my stitch in line vertically with the top of my Y, and then horizontally even with the bottom of the, I called it a Y, the V. And then the same thing over here. You want it even and even. And then I would bring my needle up almost to where the tail ends the previous stitch. And I like the look that gives. So if you wanted to, you could even mark it with a friction pen, which is heat erasable, or any other marking instrument. So you could put a dot where you're coming up, a dot where you're going down, a dot where you're coming up, and then this would be the length of the tail. So it's basically like a triangular shape plus the tail. And if you wanted to be super precise, you could get a ruler and measure this out, and your stitches would be perfectly uniform if you wanted to do that. So I mentioned that I'm in Orlando, and I forgot my panel in Montana. I didn't bring it. Well, let me rephrase that. I left my original panel in Montana, so I can't show you where I stitched the fly stitch on my original panel because I don't have it with me. But I'm at the shop, and I was looking through some of the samples that I have from different workshops. And so here is one that I found where I used the chain stitch. And you can see this is a pre-printed panel, but you know, these scallop shapes here, what I did is I did the fly stitch, all these in pink. And because there's a little bit of space in between this scallop and this line, this circle, I made I did a little short tail, you know, after I did the V part. So I did the short tail, but then I demonstrated for the class. You can also do, let me zoom in a little bit. So these are the ones that have a little bit of a tail. And then this one, I just did almost, I did without a tail. I just kind of did a short stitch over that V. ignore this. That's a different stitch that we're not talking about right now. So, and this is another example of, even though it's a circle, of how you could do a horizontal border, where you just, you go, instead of going top to bottom, you're going to go left to right. Here's another example that I found in the shop. So you've got 3 hearts here, and they're done with 3 different stitches and 3 different colors of thread. The outer heart is stitched using the fly stitch. So if I zoom in, maybe you can see how they're just nestled in between. And I started, well, let me zoom out one more time. So I started here and I went this way, ended it, and then started here and went that way and ended it. And I basically kind of held my hoop like this because I wanted to stitch, you stitch from top to bottom. So the very first stitch that I did here is just a straight stitch. And then I started the fly stitch, with that V and then the tail and then a V and a tail. So that's another example of what the fly stitch looks like. So on the original panel, and what I'm going to do here is I stitch a few fly stitches in the center of these long ovals. This shape is also a good shape to do the satin stitch. So if you wanted to wait until we do the satin stitch before you go and do the fly stitch all over the place, just keep that in mind. I know it's kind of hard to plan all of your panel when you don't know exactly which stitches are coming up or where is a good place to stitch them. So I just thought I would point that out, that you could also do the satin stitch in here. But since I did the fly stitch originally in these spots, that's where I'm going to demonstrate them. The color that matches this top oval is Easy 21. The yellow it is Easy M18. The first time around, I didn't do every single oval, but I'm just going to give you the colors just in case you wanted to do all of them. The orange would be Easy 15. And then there's 2 different pinks in here. One's more of like a salmon color, but I would use the same color. So I would use Easy 20 on both of them if I were using the colors that I had on hand. So because these are different shapes, different lengths, and they're a little wonky, I am going to eyeball where I'm going to be stitching, which is what as you've probably figured out by now, which is what I do quite a bit. So I'm going to start at the top and work my way down. I'm going to start my V right there. So the left part of my V will be here, and the right part of the top right will be here, right there. So I'm going to pull it to the back, but I'm not going to pull it all the way through, and I've got my loop there. So I'm going to bring my needle up, and I'm going to bring it up down to here, making sure it's in the center. And then I'm going to pull it through, making sure I form that loop. And then I'm going to just do a short little tail. I think I can get 3 stitches in this oval, this pink oval. So my second stitch, I'm going to bring my needle up even this way vertically, and then even with the top of my tail or the bottom of the V. And I'm going to pull that all the way to the front. Bringing my needle up right below the tail of the previous stitch. So that is how I used the fly stitch on my panel. I would do the same steps if I wanted to stitch inside the yellow oval or the orange oval or the pink oval, and I would adjust it based on how long the oval is. So, all right, so I know I've already demonstrated this fly stitch on this practice piece of fabric, and I demonstrated it on the panel just a minute ago, but it was just really hard to see when the thread matches the fabric so closely. So I thought I would demonstrate it again on this practice piece. I just sort of drew a little bit of an oval and I started stitching and realized I didn't have the camera on, so I had to pull it out. But anyway, so I'm going to just demonstrate it again in case you are wanting to do the fly stitch in those ovals on the panel the way that I did, where they nestle. And so you're going to work vertically from top to bottom. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. All right, so I'm going to start my V right there. The top is rather narrow, so it's not going to be very wide, this first stitch. And I use the shape of the whatever I'm filling in to determine, you know, how wide, how long my stitches are. So this would be the top of my V. And remember, we're not bringing the thread all the way to the back. I usually hold it with my thumb. All right, so when I make the point of my V, I'm going to bring my needle up in the middle to pull, and then I'm going to pull my needle and thread all the way to the front. And then I will make a short stitch down vertically for my tail. And so that's what I call it when I'm demonstrating the stitch, the V and then the tail. So when I start my second stitch, what I want to do is I want the top of my V to be even with the bottom of the previous V, which is also the same as the top of the previous tail. So I'm coming straight down, lining it up this way and vertically, and then this way horizontally. And so the top of my V will be here on the left, and the top right will be right there, even with that V. And holding that loop, before I take the needle all the way to the back, I'm going to bring it up right below the previous tail, but not on top of it, just leaving a teeny tiny bit of space. And then I will pull it all the way to the front and make my tail. Now, this oval is wonky, so my stitches are a little wonky. Let me fix that. Now, if I'd been paying more attention rather than talking and trying to describe the stitch, I would have made the second and third stitch maybe a little bit wider. I was so focused on explaining how you should line it up that I did not take into consideration that this shape got wider. And when I did my panel, I kind of made my stitches a little bit wider as well. But everything else I tried to make sure, you know, lined up. And that is just a personal preference on when you do your stitches, how you want them to look. If you want them to all be uniform, if you want them to kind of be organic and flowing with the shape of whatever you're filling in. And I probably should have curved it a little bit more too, but I wasn't planning on demonstrating it this way. I was just going to demonstrate it on the panel. And then I realized you couldn't really see it on the panel. You could also do this part in one step where you go down and then up. You can angle, your needle. Just do it all in one stitch or one step if you wanted. So yeah, so that's what I did. So that's pretty much how I filled in the ovals on my panel using the fly stitch. I hope you can adapt this to your panel if yours is different than mine, or even if it's the same. If you want to stitch in some different places, you could do the same thing I'm doing, as far as taking ovals and filling it in. You could do that with the black ones here, that orange one in the middle of the blue flower, even those tall white ovals in the orange flower. It's also good as a border stitch. You would have to mentally visualize it or mark it on this yellow flower, for instance, but I could see doing like a scalloped all the way around this yellow flower. I think that would look nice as well. You could even do it on the stem of these little hearts. I think that would be another fun place to do the fly stitch. So when I announced that I was going to be doing the live Zoom on Thursday, I had said I would demonstrate an embroidery stitch that's not in our lineup of stitches. Well, because I was having technical difficulties, I was not able to do that on the live Zoom. So I had told them that I would just record a video demonstrating that stitch and that I would just include it in this week's video. So the stitch that I'm going to demonstrate, it's called the back stitched chain stitch. It starts with a foundation of chain stitches. And so I'd just gone ahead and stitched this little wavy line of chain stitches. So once you do your chain stitches, and you're going to do the back stitch in between all of those chain stitches. So I like to use a different color thread for something like this. So I'm going to bring my needle up in the center of the second chain stitch. And then I'm going to take a back stitch. I'm going to take my needle down into the center of the first chain stitch. And then bring my needle up in the middle of the third chain stitch. I will go back one stitch into the second one, and then I will repeat that all the way through the chain. So you're basically doing a back stitch. You're just making sure your needle comes up in the center of each chain. And then when you go back down, you're going back to the previous stitch. So very easy once you know how to do the chain stitch, which you can go back and look at a video if you haven't done it yet, or if you want to refresh your memory. And the same thing with the back stitch. You just combine the two. So yeah, that's just an extra stitch that you can try, and you can even use the same color for the chain stitch and the back stitch, and then it would just give a little bit more texture to whatever area that you're stitching. And that reminds me, so on the Zoom call, someone had asked about the raised chain stitch and stitching them on the stems. And the question was whether I was going to be using the raised chain stitch on all of my stems, because there's quite a few, you know, they all have the thick line, which is, you know, why I used the raised chain stitch originally. And so there's an opportunity to do the raised chain stitch in a whole lot of places. And so what I had told her is that when I did my first panel, I did do the raised chain stitch on quite a few stems. So let me let me put it this way. If I stitched a stem like this, I did use the raised chain stitch, but I did not stitch all of the stems. I left some of them without any stitching. But since I really like doing the raised chain stitch, I would probably do that on most of my stems, because I really like to do that stitch. But other stitches that you can use would be the chain stitch. So the chain stitch can also be applied to any of these other stems where I usually did the raised chain stitch. And so now that I've demonstrated doing the chain stitch and the back stitch together, you could also do that on a stem. And then another stitch that we have not done yet, I think we do this in 2 weeks, is the satin stitch. And you could also do the satin stitch on the stems. So I thought I would pass along that question and my answer in case you were wondering the same thing. And if you have any other questions along those lines, you can ask them in the comments on the, on the video, or you can send me an email, whichever is easier for you. So happy stitching, and I will see you next week. Thanks.